About 100 years ago, Sri Aurobindo withdrew from active politics in order to pursue a line of development that he realized was far more important for humanity. Having passed through a series of experiences, including the experience of Brahman and of the immanent divine in the world, he was given a series of revelations of the nature of the further development of human evolution, and pursuing that line, it became obvious that unless there was a radical change of consciousness, human evolution itself would not succeed in making that next leap. Dedicating himself entirely to that pursuit, over the early years of his sadhana in Pondicherry, soon thereafter joined by the mother, he pursued this line and realized in himself that higher consciousness, which he refers to in his writings as the supermind. That higher consciousness which is necessary for the next step in human evolution. He wrote during that period in the Arya most of his major works, 6 or 7 of them at least, simultaneously, and they were all written from his experience and his realizations, including the realization of the supermind and the transformation of his own mind by that higher consciousness, which was in a process of development and stabilization. In 1926, there was a capital step in this effort when the over-mental consciousness was brought down into the physical body of Sri Aurobindo and established in the material world, in him first. This is to be understood in the larger context of the whole process that he was pursuing, and only then can we better understand what was happening and then what is happening today. The realization of a higher consciousness can be had in its own level. For example, the consciousness can rise into the intuitive consciousness, or in the overmind or the supermind, and know it in its own level, and then return, leaving the mind and the rest of the life largely unchanged. Or it is possible to bring down that higher consciousness into the lower, first as an influence, then as a direct, more and more direct action, and eventually to establish that higher consciousness in the lower as the dominant power, transforming the lower by that higher. This process of transformation at first involves a series of descents and a time needed to assimilate and stabilize the transformation. But the realization of the higher consciousness itself can take place much sooner. So this overmental consciousness had already been realized by Sri Aurobindo and the mother, and it was the struggle to bring it down and establish it in the lower ranges which was the focus of their effort during that time. And the overmental was established in their mind, the mental consciousness, in the life force, the subtle physical body, and then eventually in the gross physical itself. This was a capital step in the whole evolutionary effort. Because unless the overmental consciousness is established, the supramental consciousness cannot come down in its purity, in its direct action. In 1926, the mother observed that she noticed the presence of Sri Krishna hovering around Sri Aurobindo for some time, for a few days. There was a special presence in the air, in the whole community of the ashram, a presence of delight, preparing, intensifying. And then one day she said she saw this form of Sri Krishna enter Sri Aurobindo physically. She went and commented to him, and he simply nodded. But that was the capital step, the establishment of the overmental in the physical, which was the assurance that the supramental also would be established in the physical eventually. So that was the point where Sri Aurobindo formally withdrew from direct personal contact with the sadhaks in order to dedicate his entire concentration to bringing down the supramental into the physical. The mother was given formal responsibility of all the sadhaks and their sadhana in the ashram and outside the ashram. I remember a narration of one of the very old sadhikas in the ashram. Her name is Swarnadi. She was one of the earliest sadhaks who came to Sri Aurobindo and the mother even before she visited Pondicherry. She was at that time a housewife in Bengal, and through correspondence she was in touch with Sri Aurobindo, and he used to guide her, and of course there was the direct action of his help on her sadhana. And she describes how she had, sitting in Bengal, a series of experiences which she did not understand, and it's only when she wrote to Sri Aurobindo that his explanations would come. One that she described was such: while she was swinging the child in the cradle, she would go into meditation and sometimes into trance. And once she had the sudden awareness of the whole subtle being, the subtle body, and she saw the 7 chakras within herself and the rising flow of the Kundalini energy and the channels of Ida, Pingala, Sushumna which are all things we read about and we see pictures in books. But she experienced that within her, and not knowing what it is, but trusting that she was being led, she wrote to Sri Aurobindo for an explanation. In one of these, and around that time, 1926 or just after, she had an experience in which Sri Aurobindo pulled her out of her body. She found herself floating above, held by his hand, and drawn rapidly a great distance and brought to over Pondicherry. And then, she says, she was taken into a room where she met a beautiful lady. And Sri Aurobindo said, "This is the mother, and hereafter she will be responsible for your sadhana." Later, many years later, when she came to the ashram physically, she was taken around to some of the houses, and she was taken to the house which is presently the archives. And she says, entering that space, she recognized this as the location where she was introduced to the mother. This is where the mother had stayed in the very early periods of the ashram before they all shifted to the present main building of the ashram. So these are some indications of that time when he gave formally the responsibility of the sadhana to the mother as the divine Shakti. He himself withdrew from direct contact physically, but maintained that spiritual contact inwardly and of course directly on a spiritual level, and indirectly through correspondence with all the sadhaks. Often his writing would go on for 8 hours at a time, and it was an arrangement between Sri Aurobindo and the mother that one of them would always be awake. So in daytime, the mother had to look after affairs of the ashram as well, during which time he would take his sleep, and then once she would go to retire, he would be awake through most of the night, during which time the writing of letters would go on. The intensity of the spiritual, the supramental consciousness building upon him around his body was so great that it would be unbearable to most people. And it was a strict instruction of the mother that those who were working on the first floor outside Sri Aurobindo's room were not to look at him directly. They had to come, do their work, and go away, avoiding looking across. Though, of course, there were some who could not avoid having a casual glance at least, and the image was always described as one of great divinity and beauty. During the time of the darshan, in those days 3 times a year, they would both be meeting all the sadhaks together physically. And when at some point someone wrote that the gap between the February darshan and the August darshan is too great, and they would like to have another darshan in between, Sri Aurobindo wrote back that for him it would be a significant delay in the work, because every time that there was a darshan, he had to reduce the intensity of the spiritual power in and around him so that it could be bearable to people who came to see. So it would affect his work if another darshan was added in between. As you're familiar, he described how he has caught the supramental by the tail in a indicative but almost a joking manner, having caught it to create a constant pull to bring it down into the physical was the task that he had dedicated himself to. In his own consciousness, the supramental had already been established in the mind, in the vital, and to a great degree in the subtle physical. By the time he left his body, even the subtle physical was fully transformed by the supramental. The last part of establishing it in the physical consciousness was the great challenge that they worked for. And it is here that Sri Aurobindo makes a very important distinction, which it is useful for us to understand, between the overmind and the supermind. He said when he first wrote of the supermind in the Arya, his experience and view of the supermind was from the range of the mind consciousness, as distinct from later the physical consciousness. And we'll see the difference. So, when he experienced the descent of the overmind, it was seen as the lower working of the supermind. But later, when that consciousness was established in the physical, and the resistance of the physical had to be overcome, then he said it became clear that the overmind that had been realized was not the lower working of the supermind, but there was a gap. And the supermind proper, which he refers to as the Gnostic consciousness, the Gnostic supermind, Gnostic knowledge, the supermind proper involved a distinction. The distinction is this: the supermind proper is a separate grade of consciousness which is one of the oneness indivisible. That, if it were to manifest and become the world directly, would have created a world which was divine from the beginning, which never would experience the division of consciousness, which would never have experienced the involution, the loss into inconscience, and the emergence back through evolution. In order to be able to experience division, it was necessary for the supermind to then take a step down, which first entry is the overmind. A step down to division, but in the overmind, and the highest part of the overmind is still an experience of oneness, but a oneness that accepts the possibility of division. So this fine distinction between the highest part of the overmind and the supermind proper, he said, was in fact suggested in the Veda when it is said that the face of truth is covered by a golden lid. So this is the covering, which, being a golden lid, itself appearing to be of the nature of the truth, seems to be the truth itself. He explained how, in the earlier times, whenever this ascent to the supermind was attempted, it was this distinction which was missed, even by most of the great rishis of the Vedic period and later. In the Tantric phase again, there was an attempt to realize the supermind, coming very close to this distinction but not realizing it entirely. The result was, he said, because the descent of the overmind was seen as good as supermind, and yet the overmind could not overcome the extreme resistance of inconscience. Therefore, it was concluded that matter cannot be changed. Therefore, it was seen that the world was unreal and had to be abandoned. This fine distinction, he said, was the key to the transformation of matter itself. And it was that highest working of the pure one supermind, the Gnostic consciousness, that Sri Aurobindo was bringing down during that later phase. It was that which was established in his mind, vital and the subtle physical, and the transformation of the most gross physical was the final challenge left. Sri Aurobindo speaks of the formation of the mind of light as part of this process, which in his own being he had realized, which he transferred into the mother's physical body at the time that he left his own physical body. A series of events had taken place by then which made it necessary for him to leave the physical body in order to work from above and the mother from below in the physical world, to create a bridge and to bring down the supramental consciousness as an active force in evolution. When this took place in 1956, you will recall, and most of you would have read the mother's description. She says how she found herself in a form, a body larger than the whole universe, and before the gate that had to be broken to release that supramental consciousness. And it is this which we can relate to the Vedic description: the face of truth is covered by a golden lid. And in his letters, Sri Aurobindo had earlier written that unless this lid, this gap is broken, the direct action of the supramental on physical consciousness is not possible. But of that we cannot speak now, was what he had written in his letters, I believe in the late 30s. It was that lid, that barrier, that the mother broke in a single movement of knowledge and will, as she describes there. And that light and power came flowing down on the earth. Earth here means not only the physical earth, but earth consciousness, and with its impact on the whole universe. What was surprising to her was that while she expected everybody present around her to be flattened by the intensity of that consciousness, she found most people almost entirely unaware that something significant had happened. And she said only 4 people knew that something had happened. 4 people in the whole earth. And she said one of them was in Africa. You can see how in her cosmic consciousness she knew exactly what was happening in each one. And this 4th person was, later he came to the ashram and he narrated what was his experience. He said he was in Africa and looking out towards the sunset, and suddenly he had this feeling that a new world was born, and he saw the whole sky becoming golden orange, and it stayed in a magnificent light and view for a while, and then as the sun set, the colors faded. But at that point he knew that a new world was born, and he wrote of it to the mother. This event of 1956 was effectively the completion of the work for which Sri Aurobindo and the mother took birth on earth in physical form. Everything after that can be seen as an additional gift of their grace to humanity. The mother, after 1956, began actively the spreading of this consciousness through the forms of life. And before that, as you know, the ashram was kept in extreme isolation, so that nothing of the normal world or old world would intrude into this space of concentrated supramental force. But after 1956, the whole direction of things changed. She began to encourage people to form centers and to spread the knowledge and the works of Sri Aurobindo. And it was soon after that she was driving by on what is now the East Coast Road, and every time she would cross this region of the area, she would stop for a while, and sometimes she would step out of the car and look towards the west from the road. And one of her attendants asked her what it is that she was looking at, and she said, "One day there will be a great city here, that is Auroville." And of course, she had the perception of what was to come, and it took a while before the human instruments were gathered and the things could take a more concrete shape. And that is how Auroville also began. In order to bring this supramental consciousness into a direct working in human life. And we must recognize here the distinction between the establishment of the ashram and the establishment of Auroville and their relationship. There have been many casual comments of past, future, etc., which are not accurate. The ashram was established in the beginning to create a concentrated space to bring down that higher consciousness. Once it was established and active in humanity as an evolutionary principle, it was necessary to create the framework of life in which it could more and more directly manifest its truth. The ashram had limitations, not only in terms of space but also of its primary focus, and therefore the necessity of a separate framework with a different declared objective, and that's why Auroville. But between the two, there continues to be a complementary relationship at an occult and spiritual level. The ashram still remains as a focal point for the realization of that consciousness within. Auroville still remains the focal point for the realization of that consciousness in the forms of life. And therefore, even in the charter of Auroville, the emphasis is more on the manifestation in forms of life. Everything here is to be built from scratch along the lines that that consciousness chooses. And that consciousness, the supramental itself, being not a fixed, rigid mental framework, but a multifaceted, infinitely rich possibility, expressive of a single oneness. Therefore, the life forms in Auroville will also be diverse. Therefore, even their organization will undergo a series of possibilities evolving as the consciousness of the people evolves. So Mother gave no rules, regulations or laws, but fundamental spiritual principles around which these organizational structures could freely flow to reflect the needs of each moment. These two centers established on earth, both to become containers, receptacles, focal points for the direct action, for an increasingly direct action of the supramental consciousness, become for the future of humanity the promise of fulfillment in the whole world. This gives us a broad perspective of the work that they did to establish the supramental consciousness on earth. When the early sadhaks came to the ashram, they came with various ideas, sometimes having read fragments, sometimes having heard some things, but always with an inner opening and conviction that they were committed to this effort. And many of them came with expectations that because of the supramental yoga and the result of the supramental yoga, they would become immortal. That death would be overcome immediately. That was one of the ideas that the mind was attracted to. Even as today, people come to Auroville thinking that, oh, here, the practical human unity will be easily achieved and we will live in harmony forever. But they are right in the perception. But that perception, to be translated, undergoes certain stages. They come with the idea of a perfect world, a perfect harmony, of a collectivity of humanity that shares ideals to such a degree that we will constantly be at one-ment as far as our ideal is concerned. Frictions would be minimized. These expectations were often followed by disappointments, as they are even today. The first death in the ashram was a shock to the community. Oh, death is possible still. And of course the doubts come, is this for real? But the inner conviction being present, that survives the doubt. Sri Aurobindo wrote in detail of the nature of the transition. And for those who had read that and who still read it today, it helps to clear these doubts. The first thing which he points out is the evolutionary transition is gradual. Otherwise it would not be an evolution. If it is a jump from here to there with a gap in between, it is not an evolution. Evolution means from within the old, the new has to emerge in a continuity. And of course, in consciousness, it can be drastically different. But the process of emergence, therefore, has to be a continuity for it to be an evolution. And that means there is a passage of gradual change. The second point he makes is, or on this first point, maybe an observation needs to be made. There is a comment made by Osho, Rajneesh, in one of his books. He has a tendency to criticize other teachers that he does not agree with. And I believe there's only one reference to Sri Aurobindo, where he says, be careful of Sri Aurobindo, he can convince you about anything with his logic. But then the point of criticism that he brings in is, he says that Sri Aurobindo claimed that once the supermind is established and one person is transformed, the whole of humanity will be transformed. And he says, obviously, that's irrational. But that was a wrong statement, a wrong projection of Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo, in fact, has very clear statements in his letters saying that these are silly ideas. How can one person's transformation change the rest of humanity? Each one will have to go through his own process of transformation. So one person's transformation certainly can make it easier for others, but doesn't mean it will happen automatically. So this is the necessity of gradual change. It is not a sudden change in which the whole world changes in one go. The second point Sri Aurobindo makes is that the transition involves a struggle. And the struggle itself is inevitable because nature has built up in her own evolutionary process the means to retain the realizations of the past, to hold on to create a stable base and a persistent base. That very base becomes the resistance for the new step. He explains also how when the overmental consciousness begins the division, it allows all possibilities freely and pushes each one to its extreme of actualization. And therefore, in practice, in the divided consciousness of the manifest world, every single force has a right to exist and to persist and to ensure that it does everything possible to continue to persist. So given a particular situation, here are perhaps half a dozen possibilities that could actualize through this situation. Each one of them has a right to exist and a right to persist and attempt to manifest against others. And that's why the nature of this world is one of conflicting, struggling forces, out of which something emerges by a kind of a mix, either one overwhelming the other or finding a compromise or whatever form it takes. But always a mix of possibilities struggling to emerge. This struggle, he says, has three components. He uses these words: the right of persistence, the right of recurrence, and the right of resistance. These are three things which prevent natural, rapid change. So the first is persistence, which we have discussed. Every force has a right to persist. Second, if a force is defeated and it lapses, subsides, or goes into quiescence, or hides in seed form in the subconscious or inconscient, then it has a right to recur. If it gets a new chance, it will come up. And this is a right given to that force in order to ensure that every possibility can come up in every way. So even though the supramental consciousness may descend, the old consciousness in mind, vital or physical, has first the right to persist and thereby oppose the supermind. If the supermind overwhelms and replaces its working to whatever degree, and the old consciousness subsides, it has the right to recur and again come up to try to destabilize the supramental consciousness, still establishing. And through it all, the right to continue to resist, because every possibility must have the right to continue, it must have the right to resist. So there is a flux of various forces and possibilities in the mental consciousness which resist the descent of the supermind. And the mind itself, he says, being the most conscious, self-aware, is the most open, most flexible to receive the supramental. But as one goes lower into the vital, there the instinctive movements of life force are even more dull, more unconscious. And so there the resistance, recurrence, persistence are still greater. And then going down into the physical, which is not conscious, inconscient, there the resistance can be even more formidable. And that's why it is not the overmental, which is already the principle of division, but the direct supermind which can overcome finally the physical. Until then, of course, everything else can be transformed to almost any degree. But it will be at the lower parts unstable until the physical itself is overcome. So the nature of the transition is gradual. It is also a struggle because things have the right to persist, recur and resist. And then there is one more factor, that this particular transition is unprecedented. It has never before happened in history. And although attempts have been made, the supramental being brought directly into the physical has never been done. In the Veda, Sri Aurobindo observes, the Vedic rishis could bring down the supramental into the mind, into the vital, but the body itself was seen as the container for this transformed inner consciousness. The body itself received the glow, reflected or bathed in the supramental consciousness, but remained physically inconscient, not transformed physically. And it was this inability to transform the physical consciousness which was, as he says, the flaw and the limitation of the Vedic experience, which later led to the Buddhist and the Mayavadin realizations. This transformation of the substance of matter is unprecedented. And therefore, it has its own surprises, its own difficulties, which cannot be fully anticipated. So, this being the nature of the transition, we must recognize that while that which we have sensed intuitively in our own ideals is true, that truth may involve a struggle to realize. So, in practical daily terms, while Auroville is the space where human unity is meant to be realized and will be realized and has been realized even in parts, in fragments, in not too stable circumstances, the process itself stabilizing may take time, will take time. And that's all right. That's part of the game, that's part of the journey, part of the effort. The question is it certain or is it still doubtful? Once the supramental consciousness has been established on earth, the final transformation is certain. Will it be here? Yes, as long as we become the representative aspiration in humanity for that transformation, that's where it will happen most soon, most easily. These communities created for this purpose, we are drawn here for this purpose, and therefore these are certainly destined to be the cradle of that transformed consciousness. Well, just as we had our own expectations, which seemed at first to be belied, so too in humanity we find a similar struggle. Even in the past, in the collective consciousness of humanity, there are memories of past cycles. Even in the past, where this transition has been anticipated, it has been belied, defeated perhaps, and seeds of doubt, of the possibility even sown. But always there was a perception of something extraordinary destined to happen. And in every civilization, in every spiritual manifestation, you will find it taking certain forms. I thought it interesting to share this perspective of how in various traditions and from various perspectives, there is a sense of something dramatic to happen. Most of you are familiar with the Mayan calendar and its end in the year 2012, December 21st, down to a few minutes. Now, what is special about this calendar carved in stone many thousands of years ago is that the calendar is still accurate in predicting eclipses down to a few seconds. And this calendar, created by such an advanced civilization, comes to a dead halt at a precise date and time. So for many, it's another doomsday prophecy, as the year 2000 was for many an end of an age, or perhaps even the end of humanity. So there are similar ideas which are promoted, but it's not that which is important. It's the sense of an end of an age and the beginning of a new age, which was foreseen by the ancient civilizations or their mystics. There is similarly in religious traditions the idea of an end and a new beginning. In the Sufi tradition, for example, about 1,000 years ago, there is a Sufi mystic who spoke of man stepping on the moon, and that signaling the transition to a new era. And he says that when man steps on the moon, Islam will rise to its highest peak and then it will fade away. There is a similar prophecy in the Catholic Christian tradition where one of the very mystical popes about 500 years ago wrote a series of visions in his diary describing the future popes to come, and it was discovered about 50 years ago. It seems to have been very accurate in all the descriptions, including the last two popes, the one before the last, that there would be an assassination attempt, and the earlier one which would not be from Italy, and the present one is described as the last pope, and there will be no more popes. We find similarly in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition the prophecy that the 14th Dalai Lama will be the last, and the present is the 14th. So in all these mystical religious traditions, one finds an inbuilt perception of their own end as religions. What after that? Nothing is clearly stated. Because perhaps it could not be seen. It could not be understood in mental terms. And only a new possibility. Perhaps the very fact that it is the supramental consciousness opens out indescribable possibilities. We find more recently there are others who have prophesied transitions. The one that I find worthy of respect is that of Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet as he is called from America, who in the mid-30s foresaw an evolutionary change and gave dates for it, saying between the year 1956, 1958 up to 2000. And the 56 is the interesting part. He mentions 56 or 58. Beginning then up to 2000 will be a change in human evolution, as if a new step in evolution would begin. And around the time of 2000, he said, the tilt of the earth would also change. Now, I don't think that has so far been discovered, but we do see 1956 onwards, and as we know, because of the supramental descent, so much has changed. There is something else which I find even more fascinating, is the rhythms that nature herself has set for her own fulfillment, as should be obvious when we look at the large span of time. The psychological changes in consciousness are seen or would be seen to happen in certain natural rhythms. The cycle of yogas, for example, is one such, where Sri Aurobindo explains the rationale of that cycle, where a truth is first lived, and then it is held by force of will, and then it is organized by external organizational pressures, and then eventually every attempt to hold it by artificial means gives way, creating the four natural rhythms, cycles or ages, yugas, of the normal evolutionary spiral. Yes, going in circles, but each circle taking it one step higher. So the cycles of yugas, for example, are mapped out across so many years in a very precise mathematical timing, to which Sri Aurobindo doesn't give much importance. He sees them more as indicative rhythms, but still, when we look at the large span of development in nature, a cycle ending may not end exactly on the year measured out in the yuga calculation, but somewhere around that time, which in evolutionary terms will mean maybe in the 1,000 years around that time. That's good enough. That's very precise for nature. So when we look at nature's cycles, we find some unusual cycles, and they all coincide around this present. One of the most dramatic cycles is the cycles of extinction of 64 million years. Every 64 million years, for reasons we do not understand, there is a mass extinction. where more than 80% of the species are eliminated. And there is a dulling of the variety of life forms, and immediately after, a sudden efflorescence of new life forms, often more rich. This immediately after, again in evolutionary terms, could be a span of a few thousand years. In 64 million years, that's a blink. The last extinction took place exactly 64 million years ago with the extinction of the dinosaurs. And the next one, therefore, is due somewhere around now. And now again in evolutionary terms, we can't say exactly which year. It's not 2012 December 21st. Sometime in the next 500 years or 1000 years. There is another interesting cycle, which is the Ice Age cycle, which has a rhythm of about 100,000 years, during which the bulk of that time involves a large expansion of ice all over the earth, from the north and south poles growing towards the equator. And then a cycle of 10,000 years about, during which the ice recedes and there is a warmer phase. Now the last receding ice was about 10,000 years ago. So the next cold period of the Ice Age is due to start about now, next 500 years or so. And there's another interesting rhythm of the physical process, geophysical process of the earth, which is of the magnetic field of the earth itself, which flips. The north becomes south, south becomes north, suddenly. Again, in geological terms, suddenly means within a span of 100 years, not more. But it's not that the magnetic pole gradually drifts and switches around. It blinks out, fades out, and then switches on again with the opposite polarity. What makes it happen is still not understood. But we can see the imprint of this change of polarity on Earth. And often before the change of polarity, the pole of the magnet of the Earth drifts around rapidly. I'm told that recently it has been seen that the magnetic pole of the Earth is drifting about 1 kilometer a year or something like that, which is very fast for the whole Earth. And the last flip of the pole took place a certain number of years ago, and the next one is due now, in the next 400 years. All of these cycles involve some kind of destruction, some kind of a loss, because if the Earth's magnetic field fades out, then there is a barrage of the solar wind upon the Earth's surface, which can lead to extinction of life. All of these indicate some kind of a drastic physical change around this time. So it's almost as if nature also has been preparing all her rhythms for some dramatic change, leap. What form will that change take place? That's the question we have to ask. Many people who had seen in trance states, somewhat like Edgar Cayce, or who had channeled information, had spoken of dramatic earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, lands going underwater, rising out, etc. The mother herself mentions parts or whole of England going underwater, Italy going underwater. Elsewhere, to another devotee, she spoke of parts of Indonesia going underwater. All of these indicate dramatic physical changes. But when Mother was asked, will there be such great disasters? Her general comment was, the supramental manifestation in 1956 has changed everything. She said first of all, she said the supramental consciousness will work for the most rapid evolution, the most smooth transition, the most harmonious change. Even if it is through conflict, even if it is through struggle, the extent of conflict and struggle will be minimized by its action, so that we can get across with the least difficulty, even if difficulties are necessary. And so, she said, most of these past prophecies of great destruction were either greatly diminished or modified or cancelled. And much of this depends on the state of human consciousness. It is an interesting fact that has been measured physically, that whenever there is a mass connection of human beings in feelings or thought, there is a change in the vibration of individual atoms. I have mentioned this earlier on other occasions. It's called the Global Consciousness Project, which measures the vibrations of certain atoms in a computer. And what we observe is that whenever there is a mass event of people thinking together, feeling together as after a disaster, there is a reduction in the randomness of the physical vibrations of all atoms on Earth. This shows a close connection between the human consciousness as a species and the physical processes of the Earth itself. And therefore it would not be surprising for us when we are told by mystics and spiritual teachers that even earthquakes, volcanoes, the weather itself is affected by the state of consciousness of human beings on a collective level. An individual can only affect so much, but the collectivity has a great impact. So, most of these dramatic and perhaps destructive transitions will likely be modified, reduced, or will be used if humanity refuses to change. Mother gave ample warnings. She said if humanity does not change by choice, then it will be through crashing circumstances that the change will be forced. If, for example, we do not stop the destruction of our environment, then eventually that environment will be destabilized to such a degree that we would not have enough food for our own survival. And that's a crashing circumstance. Survival of humanity itself being brought in question by our own stupidity. But if we take corrective actions soon enough, then obviously not only will we survive, there is of course the price to pay for the damage already done, but we will create a better synergy with nature and lead perhaps to an even greater harmony for the generations to follow. That's the point of choice. And the choice centers around what is our priority as a humanity. Are we going to expend ourselves in the moment's satisfaction of desire and egoistic claim? Or will we widen our perspective, view the larger humanity, feel our oneness with the whole and with the times to come? In the last 200 or 300 years, there is one prominent philosophy that science has thrown up, which is largely responsible for the problems of today. And that is the idea that our consciousness is the product of a material process. That our mind and our awareness itself is a biological side effect. And the conclusion from there is, I, who am enjoying my life, will die with the body's death. If that be the case, and if, as science would suggest, we are the result of a freak accident of chance and a product of chance, then the only meaningful thing to do with life is to make the most of each moment to satisfy my desires. Because after that, it doesn't matter. And in any case, I am here by chance, so it doesn't matter what I do. And it is this materialist, reductionist philosophy which is at the heart of the present destructiveness of the human species. We have been described almost in jest, but very truly, as a virus on the face of the earth, destroying everything, consuming everything, with no care or concern for sustainability. And this is a falsehood of life. But as long as we live by this falsehood, the end result will also be a falsehood. But this very state and perception, this philosophy of life, is in direct contradiction to what the supramental brings upon earth. It is a consciousness of truth, a consciousness of oneness. And there is nothing in this present mindset of consumptive destruction which offers it a support. So there is a pressure, a tension, even a crushing, destructive pressure, because the forms of this past have to be destroyed if they do not change by themselves. And there is a struggle of the new consciousness and the old, resistance of the old. You will recall the prayer that the mother gave to the students. Make of us the hero warriors that we aspire to become. May we fight successfully the great battle of the future that is to be born against the past that seeks to endure, so that the new things may manifest and we be ready to receive them. So the nature of the struggle and our role in it is summarized in this single prayer. And she wrote when giving this prayer that this is to be repeated by all students every day. And I think we are all students both of the yoga and of life, and it's a general guidance we could also take advantage of. We are hero warriors. And in us is the potential for receptivity, individually and with spaces like ours, collectively. Not so everywhere on earth, where it is more individual than collective. Here the collective consciousness is stronger. And we are the space in which the receptivity is greatest, and that higher consciousness and its gifts can be received directly. But there is a struggle. And it takes place in our collectivity and in us individually. What is the affiliation that I have in myself? And to what? Will I live by that philosophy, or I would like to do this, I would enjoy doing that, this is convenient for me, so let me just do it? Or will I at that moment step back and ask, what is it that the divine consciousness would want of me? There's a point of transition there where I have to choose which is more important, I or that. My ego shrinks from submitting to that, because it feels that when I submit to that, I don't get satisfaction. That may fulfill itself, but I don't get satisfaction, and I am more important. And it's necessary for the ego sense to recognize that that is not other than itself. The ego itself is a reflection of that and a distorted expression of that. And the fulfillment of the ego is when it can recover its own completeness in that. And so to submit to that can be a joyous experience when we relate to that differently. I submit to my own highest aspiration, which is that. I submit to my own highest potential, which is in that. And then the ego can participate and give itself more easily. But at every point there is a choice. And in every relationship and in every conflict and in every situation there is a choice. And while it is accepted that we will sometimes fail, the question is, which is the greater in the balance? Do I submit to my own higher knowledge or conviction or ideal more often? And as long as we make a clear tilt towards the higher, the battle is already half won. The second half is a process of consolidation and stabilization. But as long as this first half, where I choose and submit to the highest that I can reach at this moment, which may change, which is not a problem, but I persist in making that effort at every moment, the half the battle is already won. The rest is a question of time. When Mother was asked, how will we know that this new consciousness is beginning to work and is beginning to establish itself physically? She said there will be two signs of the supramental working in the physical consciousness. Of course, in the mental consciousness it has already done much, which we will touch shortly. But in the physical consciousness, she said there are two signs. The first, she said, is a change in weather patterns. And the nature of that change will be that the whole earth will become more and more temperate, gradually again. The extremes of heat and cold will become less. Now, practically what this means is the hottest places will become cooler and the coldest places will become warmer. So the melting of the polar ice caps is part of that process. But also in places which are tropical, you will find the cold lasting longer or the extremes of heat becoming dulled. Something which I think all of us have already begun to perceive even where we live. But necessarily, as was discussed earlier, the transition is gradual and involving a struggle. So there are fluctuations. And it's never happened before that these fluctuations have been the kinds that we see today, where in some parts of North India, for example, during winter there was a heat wave not once but 3 times. And every time the heat started, the trees would begin to sprout their leaves, and every time the cold came back, they would drop the leaves again. And within a month, it happened 3 times. It's never happened before. Even nature is confused because her rhythms have been destabilized during the transition. And of course, we have the famous observation that the mother made to Huta, that the part of the land around the Matrimandir was to be dug out to make a lake. And she said that soil was to be placed on the northern side to make a hill, an artificial hill, on which fir trees are to be planted. And Huta says, fir trees? Mother says, yes, because there's going to be snow. Snow here would give you an idea of how radically the weather patterns are due to change all over the world. New rhythms will have to come in place, before which there will be destabilization of existing rhythms. How soon? Well, it doesn't sound like it will be too far away if it's a question of building this hill and planting fir trees. In evolutionary terms, it's very, very close. But in human terms, it might be a generation or 2. We don't know. Maybe sooner. So this was the first change Mother spoke of in the weather patterns by the action of the supramental consciousness and evening out a greater harmony. The other physical change, she said, will be in the human body. The form of the human body will undergo a change, and the nature of that change, she said, was the distinction between the male and female forms would become less. The human body itself would become more androgynous, and this will be seen most and first in those who develop the body consciousness, such as gymnasts and athletes. And it's interesting to see that when you observe the Olympics, it's difficult to make out whether it's a man or a woman, especially when it comes to the gymnasts and athletes. the very focus of their concentration on the physical consciousness to make it more aware, which is the only way you can excel in whatever skill you develop physically. To make it more aware makes it a space on which the supramental can act more directly. And then, of course, everything changes from there. We could also perhaps anticipate, as part of those changes, an extension of the physical biological lifespan, which in fact has happened. Though modern science will take credit for it, saying, oh, we have better nutrition and better medication. But I'm not too sure if that is entirely true, because very often we find where the new medications are introduced, there is an increase of ill health. Whereas the more indigenous tribes of different parts of the earth seem to already have had a superior health to begin with. And yet there is an increase in lifespan generally. Of course, this will be seen more in spaces where the body consciousness has been developed consciously and there is an opening to the higher consciousness deliberately. So in the ashram and Auroville, these are two spaces where you do find people on the average living much longer than elsewhere in the world. This change of physical form, I will share with you an interesting study that has taken place in the ashram's physical records. We have records going back 50 years of all the students and their medical checkups, height, weight, and other things. And these were recently put on the computer, and we drew out statistical measurements. What we find is over the last 3 decades, the average height of both boys and girls is growing. But the difference between the average of both is narrowing. So you have an average of boys going up, average of girls going up. So there are 2 slopes, but the slope of both is narrowing and coming together closer. It's an interesting observation. How is it happening? Well, that's part of that working. There's also an interesting observation that was shared by people who have been on earth longer than I have. The observation that newborn babies are different physically. It used to be 30 or 40 years ago that babies were born bald, fists closed and eyes closed, sleeping much more. And it so happens in the last 20 years we find far more babies born with hair, hands open, eyes open immediately after birth, and even attempting to communicate in some way. This shows that evolution is squeezing part of the development after birth back into the womb. Now, in the womb, you already see the entire biological evolution of life represented within those 9 months, starting from a form which is a single-celled creature to something that appears like a tadpole, then appears like a fish, then appears like a frog, then appears like a whatever stages, baby monkey, and then eventually the human form. But things which took place after birth are also being pushed back into the womb. So everything indicates an acceleration of human evolution physically. These are the most dramatic because they indicate most objectively. Less dramatic but equally important, but because they're subjective, are the psychological changes which have been taking place. And the transition from one age to another is described as having a pralaya, destructive phase. That's the term used in Sanskrit. Pralaya is the destruction between 2 ages. And if the Kali Yuga is ending now and the new cycle of the new Satya Yuga is to start, the transition point also involves a destruction. There is an interview of Sri Aurobindo dated 1907, which appeared in a Madras newspaper, the full text of which has never been printed, and I don't know why. Perhaps because it is the only time he seems to have made a prophecy with dates. In that he says, or he is quoted as saying, that in 1907, marks the end of the Kali Yuga, the first 5,000 years of the Kali, and the beginning of the transition for the new Satya Yuga. And then there is a text that very prophetic, and you must keep in mind it's 1907, nobody could imagine what would happen next. And he uses words like, the high will become low, and the low will become high, and the oppressed and the depressed will be elevated, and in the midst of all these changes, India will become free, and so on. But these were indicative of what he already foresaw. And you can see that the low becoming high and what communism did in the subsequent decade could not have been anticipated earlier, and various other changes. But what we are seeing is this huge churning taking place in the mass of humanity. Even a reversal of priorities, capacities, authorities, and it's part of that transition. Chaotic at first. But in the chaos is often the greatest opportunity for change. When things are rigidly structured, there is very little chance for change. So it's almost as if a transition through chaos is inevitable, destructive. Of this, Sri Aurobindo said, this pralaya is not a physical destruction but a psychological change. A psychological destruction of past structures and values. And the most obvious of these are the institutions built by mind. We organized human life in certain ways. We created governments. We created legal structures. We created management systems. We created family units and frameworks. All of these are being loosened up and even being brought to a point where they appear to prevent further growth. Governments, which were the means by which we organized our security as a nation, are today the greatest resistance to change. Sources of corruption, sources of the persistence of the past. And almost everybody feels oppressed by governments all over the world. And that itself shows you that there's going to be a sudden change. It might be dramatic, it might be gradual, we can't say, but there is going to be a change, and a radical change in the way governments exist. They have become obsolete in the way they've been running. We find other legal institutions, management institutions, always involving a dominance of a fixed, rigid structure, again being broken apart. The most dramatic of these today, and immediately around us, is the change in the economic system, the collapse of capitalism itself. Because the present framework of capitalism is also based on a falsehood. It's based on money being represented negatively. Money, as you know, is a power of the divine in manifestation, the power of plenitude and wealth, and being in the world manifested primarily as a vital power. The physical tokens are only representative. Money doesn't exist as paper or as gold coin or as a bank account number. It exists as a force of which there is a representation in numbers. But because the number is not the money, but represents it, it's possible to play with numbers. And the present banking system, in the form it is today, developed maybe about 300 years ago, built itself on debt. Wealth is created every time someone borrows money, and the bank includes that now as its asset, future asset. And if you think about it rationally, there is a fixed amount of money in the world, and yet everybody has to pay back interest upon it. So what happens? If you continue long enough, eventually all the money will be sucked into one source by the fact of interest payment. And what you have created in the first place didn't exist as money. The bank didn't have the money it lent you. It in fact has money because you have borrowed, and it will get it back, so it can declare that as its future asset. That's how banks work. So it creates a suction, a negative suction, which sucks out money into concentrated areas, and the whole system collapses. We've had a similar collapse mostly in the USA and Europe in the 30s. But now we have a collapse which is eventually spreading to the rest of the world. But the system itself needs to undergo a change. Economic frameworks will undergo a change. The exchange rates, the speculation on exchange rates, speculation on money that will be made, which is itself treated as money and sold off as money or investments, all of which eventually have to collapse because it's hollow, it's virtual. All of these have to go. Presently, we are told that the actual money is 1/6 of the speculative money, which we call virtual money, money which doesn't exist but which is treated as actual numbers. So even a small fluctuation in the speculative money can wipe out the entire amount of actual money, because that's 6 times greater. That whole 6 times greater portion has to collapse eventually. So these are all unsustainable frameworks which we developed. They worked for us for a while, but eventually they have to break down because they are false in their basis. It's the same error we make in our relationship with the environment in the financial system, that if you have a lake or trees here, they are not treated as assets on your balance sheet. If you cut that tree, that log now is an asset on your balance sheet. If our financial system only treats destroyed nature as an asset and ignores living nature, then obviously all of the financial processes will tend to destroy nature, to increase their asset base. So these are again values which are so intrinsic to the human mindset today because they've been on for a few hundred years now, but which were not so in our indigenous sustainable lifestyles all over the world. So all of these are also changing, institutions are changing, economies will go through a painful period of collapse and a new formation. Mindsets, ethics, morality are changing. When Mother started the physical training program in the ashram, she made it a point to ensure that women participated equally with men. And the first time she created the dress for the women to do their physical activities, one of the boldest girls was asked to wear it and stand before everybody, and there was a kind of a shock. Oh, are we going to wear this also? Wearing, at that time, long-sleeved shirts and trouser-like things, which later she made into half-sleeved shirts and shorts, boys and girls equally. It was radical at that time. That was around the time when there was still the struggle for women to be allowed to vote in many parts of the world. But she was radically ahead and she worked on it. And there's an incident which I came to hear more recently. She would encourage women also to be playing with her while playing tennis. There was a practical difficulty she faced. She would look and point to some people and ask one of her attendants, who's that person, who's that person? And the attendant noticed that she would ask more often about women than men. So she asked her, why is it that you have difficulty making out who they are? So the mother said that when I'm looking at a person, it's not so much the physical sight, I'm seeing also their psychological form. And most of the women are still unformed in their individuality, so I can't make out who they are very clearly. Now this is happening in the 50s. And then she commented to that attendant, she said, but now that I am here, all this will change. So her effort was clearly concentrated on bringing about these radical changes, and we are speaking not just of human values and perceptions and relationships, but the very nature of consciousness. You will see in most traditional societies, women are held back, suppressed, and the individuality is not allowed to form too much. But that's how families maintained their stability. The men were more individualized, women less, and there was obviously the dominance of men. Sri Aurobindo even suggests that in the past there have been civilizations where women were more powerful than men and men subservient. And he says in future nature could play with that possibility again. If he says that, then generally it indicates it's going to happen in some form or the other. But all of these were things which are destined to change because they belong to a past and a false consciousness and are contrary to what the supramental is bringing. And what does the supramental bring as far as gender is concerned is that simple statement the mother made to one of the girls who was complaining about some exercises. She said very sharply, "For God's sake, can't you just stop thinking whether you're a girl or a boy and try to be a human being?" And the gender distinction is really irrelevant in terms of consciousness. And the supramental transformation involves the rising beyond distinctions of consciousness and limitations of consciousness. It means the full efflorescence of the full power of the divine self. Nature started with distinctions, with specializations. She developed those specializations in order to create a rich diversity when they were brought back. And the mother observed that nature has decided now, this now is probably in the 50s, she said, to bring together all these specializations and mix them in a huge mix to create a sudden rich diversity. The strategy is very interesting. If you take a large number of people and allow diversity, you will get a certain diversity, but not much, because people tend to cluster together in common types. But what nature did is to extend in different areas of the earth to the extreme, the specializations. So once all extremes of consciousness have been taken up and then they are brought back and mixed together, you have suddenly a much wider and richer diversity. Because it includes all the extremes now. It's not a narrow band growing wider, but extremes developed, brought together. So this is the strategy, and she said at that point in the 50s, I believe, that nature has decided to collaborate. And there's no end to the wonders of that collaboration. And one of the changes nature has done is to bring together now and create this huge mix. So you'll find increasingly intercultural, interreligious, and interracial marriages becoming more common, which earlier the instinct in humanity felt itself repelled from, now it is drawn to. But it grows in its own way. We find equally a change in the fabric of human society, in the family structure, marriages, divorces, and through it all a kind of a grassroots coming together. Sri Aurobindo lists the various steps that evolution has taken to create units, starting from the individual, the family, then the tribe, and then the regional and the national identities, and then the human identity as one humanity. Of all of these intermediate steps, and perhaps even other sub-steps, of all of these intermediate steps, he says, nature has chosen, I'm not sure if he says nature or the divine will, but we can even see both as equivalent. Nature, let's take it as nature, has chosen to preserve only three. From the individual identity to the group human identity, there are three steps: family, nationality, and humanity. All the rest will fade away. Or they may exist subservient to these. And it's interesting to observe, and I suppose we can all do it as our own independent individual explorations, to see how these three are somehow seen to be stronger, while others are breaking apart. And where these three are being weakened, there's a reaction and an attempt to consolidate on these levels. But I suppose this describes a process which will take at least 100 years and will develop over the coming 100 years. But through these we also find a growing interdependence. which is more directly the action of the supramental. Being a consciousness of oneness, while it supports the most rich diversity, it holds it as facets of its own oneness. And so the increasing sense of oneness in humanity is the most concrete and the most direct change of the supramental on the human mind. Where 50 years ago we would have said, my nationality first. Today we speak of my humanity first. And the nations have to submit to this larger truth that we feel. The governments resisting, human beings at a grassroots bypassing governments. Creating frameworks expressive of the truth that we feel within us, even not always mentally formulated, but subliminally sensed. And we create frameworks for this kind of a interchange, the most concrete of which is the internet. The internet was not created by governments. It emerged from a grassroots process bypassed governments. Governments were caught by surprise and tried to regulate it but could not. Some still do, but they cannot eventually. Being essentially an expression of the commonality of the human people in technology, it cannot be controlled by any central agency. And we find ways to bypass any control devices. You cannot restrict on the internet anything. Everybody is able to bypass any restrictions. And the change is such that even if all governments come together and say, together we will restrict our people, it won't work. So that's one physical, I will say, organ of social expression of this deeper unity. There are others which are also growing, one of which is the mix of media. The media broadcast itself transcends national boundaries. It's a satellite broadcast, you cannot stop anybody from receiving. But there is a rapid exchange of media across the world. When a movie is released in one place, it's available all over the world, at least through the internet, if nothing else. It's translated into so many languages. People are interested in watching a different cultural value. Where earlier they were seen as oddities, today they're seen with interest. So there is in the human consciousness an urge to reach out and connect and absorb the experience of other cultures and values and perhaps their best. Which is what the mother anticipated in Auroville by asking for the pavilions of each culture to be represented here. Because the future, she said, would be for each culture to share its best with the whole world without losing its uniqueness. So a single space in which all cultures are available. Very crudely, this form is now seen all over the world in malls, where you get a food court in which 5 or 6 different kinds of cuisines are available in one space, and you can pick and choose from any, try them out, mix them, and yet the distinctiveness of each remains. It's a very crude starting point, catching the most obvious form of greed in the human being. But still, it's a good starting point, and it will widen, including even forms of dress, and most important will be the psychological values that each culture has to share with others. So this growing interdependence has taken on many forms, but ultimately all the external organized forms, including economic, are expressions of a psychological need felt within us. Who made the effort? Nobody. No individual, no government, no educational system or book has made a conscious effort to create this sense of wanting to connect with the whole. It's emerged from within the heart of humanity by the pressure of the supramental consciousness. Its result has been the creation of educational tools and other technological means to express what we already feel. But it didn't start from there. the human species itself beginning to feel this sense of oneness can be and is often assisted by problems, difficulties, dangers. Because it's part of the human makeup that when we together face a problem, we come together most easily. I find the recent large-scale natural disasters to be an interesting point of observation in which you see the groups suddenly coming together, bypassing differences. And then when they fall back, the problem has passed, when they fall back into their individualities of whatever level of unit of organization, they are no more the same. There's a connection built during the time of crisis which is not lost, and things continue to happen. There is a rapidity of change in new ideas, hopes, possibilities, experiments taking place, and all of these are part of that increase of the evolutionary pace of growth. In all these, for us particularly here, the recognition of the supramental consciousness as an active force and power, making this, assisting and guiding it, is of great importance. In the rest of the world, these changes are seen almost as a social or accidental process. But for us, there is this difference that there is a consciousness that's making it, actively leading it. It makes a difference. It makes a difference because we can open to that consciousness deliberately. In the rest of the world where this awareness is not there, there are still a few individuals who sense this new consciousness. They speak of a new age. But the idea of new age is there is an age waiting to happen. It's sensed indirectly, but the reality of it is not known. And therefore the mind's active participation, submitting to it consciously, is not so easily possible. For us it is. And that's why it is here that the most important and the most rapid change can be made most smoothly. In relating to the supramental consciousness, there are two approaches one can take. One is to view it as a vast, impersonal, cosmic power that is here working in everything, through every form, as directly as it can, that the form can bear. A finite form meeting the infinity of the supramental would not be able to bear it. It would burst apart. The earth itself could have shattered if this descent had taken place too soon. And therefore it needs an intermediate support, sometimes of one or two layers, for that action to be diminished and diluted before it can act on finiteness. The intermediate levels are what Aurobindo calls the overmental and the intuitive. So it is only through the overmind or the intuition that the supermind can act on things as they are. But it's acting. But we can relate to it, allow it to build in us these two intermediate levels of intuition and the overmind. But this is the way you would normally see it when you see it as a cosmic power. The other way to relate to it, which makes it much more direct, is to know the supramental consciousness as the conscious Shakti of the divine. The Divine Mother herself as the supramental Shakti meets us directly. And to know her in the form of the Mother, whom we adore, is then the most intimate relationship we can have. In The Mother, the little booklet, Aurobindo describes how the four powers of the Mother, Maheshwari, Mahakali, Mahalakshmi and Mahasaraswati, form in us, establish in us and fuse into one movement in which the supramental Mahashakti herself descends and works in us. Well, this is the key. If we begin by relating to her as the conscious embodiment of the Supreme as the supramental Shakti. Our hearts flow out to her in gratitude, in love, in self-giving and devotion. Our minds know her as one who is so close to us, who in fact is the one to whom we surrendered, who has called us here, who has created this space for us, and who presides over all that happens here. And our actions in life can then flow most easily in service and consecration to her. To know her not only as the Divine Mother, as the Divine Shakti, but as the supramental Divine Shakti is the means by which we can feel ourselves closest to the supramental consciousness. Whichever way we find ourselves more naturally relating to, the idea is to enter into that relation as quickly and as completely as possible. This can take many forms again, a form of concentrated meditation, a form of relation and devotion of heart, a form of work and expression in service, but by whatever means to feel the closeness of the idea or of the feelings, and to allow that closeness to gradually spread to fill the whole being. This is the way by which we place ourselves in touch with that supramental consciousness. And to the extent that we are able to do that, all the change necessary in us is done rapidly. To put it in extreme terms, there's a letter that someone wrote to Sri Aurobindo saying, I was told that if I put myself wholly in the hands of the Mother, then the transformation in me can be done instantly. Sri Aurobindo wrote back saying, yes, that is true. The condition is you have to put yourself wholly in her hands, with nothing resisting. And then of course the transformation is instant. The point is, the parts in us which are open and give ourselves without resistance are the ones which are transformed instantly. But unfortunately not all of us is so conscious and so giving without resistance. That's why there's a process, that's why it takes time. But to the parts which are given to her in this way, the change is instant. The problem is, even as I give myself and the part of me that's in my mind or my heart, most open, most conscious, there is a habit in that part. A habit that tends to bring back that persistence, recurrence and resistance. And if I give that habit itself, then even the habit is changed by her. So starting with whichever part in us is most conscious, most naturally surrendering, we begin. And as she changes that part, her consciousness seeps into the other parts. And seeping into them extends the range of awareness. And it will be a common experience for all of us that as we persist, we become more conscious of things within us we didn't know existed. Tendencies, habits, or even aspirations. We didn't know they existed, we were not conscious of those parts, and it's as if as we proceed, we become more conscious within us. And even as that happens, those parts change. Sometimes the change is extreme enough that if I look back and say, oh, 10 years ago, that's not even me. That's somebody else. I'm a different person now. Don't judge me by what I was then. I don't feel myself anything in common with that. At least in parts of our being, we have this experience. And in this yoga, therefore, we find while the goal is so much more difficult, the result achieved by the effort we put in is so much greater. Because the effort we put in is to put ourselves in her hands, and it is her infinite power that works to make the change in us. Therefore, the result is so much greater. Where is this supramental consciousness today for which Sri Aurobindo and the mother worked? Well, since 1956, it is here, now, in everything. But its action still has to be indirect through these two levels. To the extent that we open to it, its action becomes more direct. Otherwise, it still has to remain indirect. But it's there, and it pushes in and through every single atom. So where is the supramental consciousness? It's here, it fills us. It even fills our body. But it cannot act on the body directly because the body is unconscious. It fills the substance of our life force, prana. It fills the substance of our mind and the subtle inner body. But it cannot act unless that part of our consciousness opens and turns to it and invokes it. Then it acts directly, to the extent we can take, and increasing as we can take more. And it builds our capacity to take in more. Dharana Shakti. As far as Sri Aurobindo and the mother's physical manifestation was concerned, their work was completed. The realization and even the transformation of the human consciousness was taken all the way till the last point of the physical tissue remaining. Even within that, the mother observes that there are many cells in her body which were able to make that transition and open to the divine and accept the divine, and so have become immortal effectively. With all this having been established already as a prototype in the collective consciousness, the journey to follow is inevitable. So someone asked the mother, so when will we see the result of the supramental? She said, oh, it's very soon. Just wait for another 1,000 years and it will be obvious to all. Somewhere else she said, she is convinced that the human body itself will be enormously more plastic than anything we can imagine today within 300 years. I was looking at some of the Chinese acrobats live and on TV, and it is unimaginable that the human body can be so supple and so conscious. And the first question I asked them was, how long did it take you to train this? They said 2 years. And I wonder, if we were to dedicate ourselves with the same commitment that they did. Yes, they were younger, the body was still growing, so there was an easier starting point. But in terms of consciousness, even if there is rigidity of other things, in terms of consciousness, we should be able to achieve the same if we commit ourselves to this. And if we do that, then even in the very physical substance, you will have that supramental action pushing, even as it works in the mind and the vital. What prevents us? Only the lack of our effort. Everything else is there and waiting, pushing, even compelling us. And where we resist by lack of effort, lack of interest, or even sometimes revolt, then that pressure pains because we resist. Pain is only the parts in us that resist the push, compelling change. The moment we relax that part and allow the change, there is no tension and no pain. Wherever in life we find a point of pressure that pains, know that it's a part in you that's resisting. Relax, open and offer it. Allow the change there and you'll find things just flowing rapidly. Nowhere in human history has such a situation been offered to humanity. And once the transition is made into the next grade of consciousness, the effort that is there in nature to make a leap will also subside. This is the point Sri Aurobindo makes. As in the past, in the ape, there was a push to wake up into humanity, and a narrow band of consciousness made that leap with help from above. and then the effort itself subsided. So it will be with humanity. That this narrow band of effort in consciousness terms, making that transition, eventually then the effort will subside. And there will be a gap seen once again. We are among those here who are part of this narrow, concentrated effort. A push from nature, a push from our own inmost truths, from our own psychic being and soul. Both are combined, assisting each other. And from above, the supramental pulling. A three-way effort. Soul, nature, and the divine above. And a meeting of these three to make that transition. There is no greater opportunity before or, as we have seen, ever after. This is the single most important life in which we can make extraordinary progress. And sometimes I remind myself when there are other distractions, oh, that would be interesting to see, that would be interesting to experience. I remind myself, we've been through a few million lives doing the same thing. And we might have another few million lives where we can do it again if we want. But this opportunity will not come again. So it's worth it to dedicate ourselves to this effort now. But in spite of that, there are parts in the nature which pull and push. It doesn't matter. The centrality of our being oriented to that, we must remind ourselves and recenter ourselves in that aspiration every day. Otherwise, things tend to pull us out into dispersion or distraction. The renewal must be done every day, even if for a few minutes, in whatever form is most easy for us. For the rest, the help is there. I think with this perspective, I think we can take a few questions if there are any.
There is the mindset of aging. Now, in Auroville, we're 140 to over 64. And I don't see why we should go on aging.
Yes.
Because there are many ways now to do this, but it is so stubborn. So what can be done about this? Because Mother said that progress makes us young. If we stop the progress, we age.
Yes. And that's the key she gave even in the Charter of Auroville, that this is a space for unending progress, which is the guideline she has given for overcoming aging itself. So in whichever parts of our being the consciousness stops progressing, it tends to regress. And that's aging. There is no such thing as status quo in spiritual terms, because the whole universe is changing. God is growing up in the world. So if you stay status quo and the universe grows, you are actually effectively regressing. The only way to stay status quo is to keep growing. So there's either growth or there's regression. There is nothing in between. Unfortunately, after a certain point, and often it's the social mindset, especially after our formal education, we think now we have what we need. We don't need to learn more. And that's what starts the gradual decline. But being here and knowing this with the background we have been given by the Mother, it should be possible for us to continue to learn. Life is our school. Auroville is the biggest learning center in the world. So if we take it in that spirit and bring that learning process into all the parts of our being, that means not only a mental, intellectual learning and study, whatever form it takes, whatever is interesting for you, doesn't matter. Develop mental skills continuously. Second, on the vital level, again, developing the life force, making it more conscious, developing it in skill and in activities. and then develop the physical consciousness. With the physical consciousness, there is an additional difficulty that if the body is brought up to a certain degree of awareness and then neglected, it lapses back very quickly and it's difficult to get it back again to the earlier level. Knowing that, don't allow it to lapse. Work on the parts of the body which you find least conscious and develop them. Again, the process is simple. Direct your mental awareness to that part. It's as simple as that. And then imprint it and become more conscious of the substance there. But you can assist it by other processes like activities, games, skills of those parts of the body. Often it is the lower parts, the legs, which are least conscious, and it is from the toes upwards that the unconsciousness creeps up. So becoming conscious of those parts through contact, through massage, through various other activities. We know all the methods. I think it's all there. It's just that we have to spend a little time on all these three parts. But through all this, even as you develop consciousness on all three parts, to open that consciousness from each of these three towards the higher, towards the spiritual, towards the supramental, towards the Divine Mother. By such opening, she infuses there something which you could not do on your own, which is the greatness of the yogic process. Otherwise, if it's just a question of human effort, we can only go so far. We cannot make that great leap on our own. But we can create the necessary conditions in which the great leap can take place in us. Someone asked the mother, how do we make ourselves supramental? She took it with a sharp retort, just try to make yourself supramental, you'll never succeed. The monkey cannot think himself into intellectuality. The supramental can enter within us and supramentalize us. We can only create the necessary circumstances of receptivity. So again, going back to the little booklet, the mother, 3 things you must have, he says: consciousness, plasticity, and surrender. As you become more conscious, the plasticity increases, and that will be a sign, both in the physical, in the vital, in the mental. The loosening up of the rigidities and widening. And these are assisted most easily by the surrender itself in all these 3 parts. If you take the Charter of Auroville as the program of your life, you will find everything is there in it to guide us through in our yoga itself. It's an extraordinary document.
You mentioned about the internet, technologies. How do you see like genetic sciences and cybernetics and virtual reality as this already being part of this physical change?
The sudden knowledge that science has of matter and the mastery of matter by material process is something which is new and is part of the gift of the new step in evolution. While in the past we have had even greater mastery of matter, it was through occult means, including, for example, in some of the alchemical traditions, the transformation of base metal into gold. It involved occult means, not the mastery of material processes. And this is the first time that the consciousness of human mind has descended in its understanding of matter to this degree and its mastery of matter to this degree by material process, guided of course by the mind, by the intellect. But this itself was possible because there is the higher consciousness which says, okay, now I'm going to give you this knowledge. Including the knowledge of the physiological minuteness of genetics, through which we will get a certain mastery of even the biological processes. But still, that will, while it will give us a practical ability to heal the body, it will not overcome the degeneration, which is the habit of tissue. And that can only be overcome by the spiritual consciousness. So while we may have a practical health, maybe even one can now conceive, and it's discussed in science fiction, you could extend lifespan. We're designed to live for 140 years, that's the estimate. But suppose even we extended 140 or 200 years, and the mind dulls, the mind becomes rigid, the mind becomes bored, what a poor life it will be. So it's not the conquest biologically which will be the solution, but the change in psychology. The mind itself must remain young, and the cells themselves not just be replaced, but learn to submit to the higher consciousness. So while technology will provide a support from below up to a point of making comfort and a receptive base, it will finally be the change by the higher consciousness which will make the decisive change.
I want to speak about the agenda of the modern. Moses said in 1962, 30 March 1962 to Supreme, I come back, finish my agenda in 50 years. It's 2012. Alors, Moses completed.
Yes.
But maybe it's not outside, but maybe in some part of the cells of the body, depends. But Moses living everywhere.
Yes.
But it's very, very interesting about, you explained about guys and about what Moses said about it. I am sure in 2012, new world starting when from
Yes.
where is she from?
We have to take it in that spirit, but not bind ourselves to a fixed date. Because, yes, yes. And also, everything depends on us. It can happen even sooner if we allow ourselves to participate. And if we resist, it will take longer. So of the center of education in the ashram, she said, I have no doubt that one day it will be the the greatest center of learning in the world. It may take 50 years or 100 years, she says. I may not be there physically, you may doubt my presence, but I will be there and this will happen. She said it in that way. 50 years have passed, we're nowhere near that. Because we didn't make the necessary effort. In fact, we went through a phase of complete, I would say, stopping of effort to try out new things. And it was maybe a period of consolidation we had to pass through and something new to emerge. But it all depends finally on our own receptivity, individually and collectively. And as far as the collective change is concerned, well, it's for the mass to choose, made up of individuals.
I have another question. What is education, especially in India? What is your knowledge about education in India?
It will change. The entire framework of education is still based on the old industrial mindset. And as that mindset breaks down, the system itself will undergo a radical change. It will have to be more and more as we see the relationship between spirituality and religion. And the relationship is this: true spirituality means each individual has his own religion. Okay? So the same way it is with education. The perfect education system is one in which each individual has his own system. Because each one is unique. And with the supramental consciousness, this extreme diversity on the basis of a commonality is possible. And that's what it is pushing things towards. That's why we see splintering and fragmentation of all organized structures, even as there is a coming together on another level. Terrorism is an important point, and we'll close with that question. Sri Aurobindo observes that when the light comes in and is about to overwhelm the darkness consolidates itself into a concentration of darkness, exaggerating its darkness, exaggerating its strength by concentration. pretending to appear as if it is all powerful and will overcome everything. That's a pretense, created only by its specialized concentration. And that's always the last resistance. That's the sign that it's come to its end and it's about to lose. So when you see the consolidation of all the forces of resistance and regression, and exaggerating their importance through this consolidation, that's the sign that they are about to be finished. They know it, and now you can also know it. Terrorism, or let's say the forces of resistance, will catch any space where the mind is open to that resistance and regression. So it is not tied to any religion. It could have happened through any religion that prevented new thinking, that prevented opening of minds. So we have to see it from that point of view. It can even happen among scientists, which is in some way modern science is a religion in itself, because it has a certain fixed idea of life and purpose. And it's equally possible that where that becomes closed, it will find fertile ground. So the nature of the ground is not so important, but the fact of consolidation across the world of all these aggressive forces, that's the sign for us and the hope for us, because it means it's finished. They know it and they're giving their last attempt. Maybe it's painful, but we can minimize that pain in transition. But we are about to make that breakthrough. We're very close to it. Yes?
Do you think that this everywhere seen reoccurrence of reactionary forces and the fascistic tendencies in the West, in the East, among young people, among old people, Talibanization, do you think this is all a similar phenomenon?
Yes.
The temporary one?
Yes. Many forces which were defeated earlier are part of the consolidation process. Fascism, for example, has been so well defeated and as a result of the Second World War that it cannot come up today on its own. But it can come up in alliance with other forces. That's the consolidation of the regressive forces. So by itself, if it tried, it would just be beaten back instantly. But in consolidation, it's able to project itself and appear like fascism could return on earth. But that's part of the consolidation, and by itself, it doesn't have any more the same force. And it's the same, I believe, with most other forces.
But is it not also possible that it is one chance that nature is actually providing in that framework, as you said, in this principle of the reinforcement of the three possibilities?
Yes, in a sense, the recurrence is allowed so that it can be permanently removed. So the grain that remained of fascism or various other things, since it's difficult even to extract them because they are so small, when they consolidate, it's also easier to deal with them as a group, as a mass. So in consciousness terms, when the problem is a little exaggerated, it's easier to clean it out, even to recognize it, than if it remains as a small seed wandering inside, covered up. So even the recrudescence, this rising up of all this, is part of the process that indicates a final end. The problem is what we mean by finality in terms of time, how soon, how quickly it will be. That's entirely upon us. It depends on us. We cannot predict it will happen in 2 years or 20 years or 200 years. It's open. The future of Earth is left open and depends entirely on us in the choices we make as a collectivity. That's why Auroville. Mother even described looking at the whole thing in a different way. She said, to prevent another world war. The existence of Auroville prevents that, because already something is established here by which humanity can never again enter that kind of fight. So the thing is done on one level. It's done. The future of humanity is certain. The question is now of the unfoldment in terms of time. Just as, and I use this analogy which will make it clear, 1920, India became free. On those levels, it was achieved. But from there, Sri Aurobindo said it's a question of time and of unfolding through circumstances. It could have happened in 22. All the circumstances physically were ready. The British were about to negotiate, and that's when a few key leaders misdirected the whole freedom struggle into a different direction. And it led to the split along religious lines, which 20 years later became the division of India, etc. So that was the stupidity of human nature. Of course, you can say forces use human beings, but still, it represented lack of readiness in the collective consciousness to overcome those forces, to refuse them. So, the whole thing was postponed, and now the reunification of this division is also to take place. But it will take place. Similarly with humanity, with the transition into the new consciousness and the new world. It's there, it's ready, it's filling everything even as we breathe. It's the question of the degree of receptivity in the mass. And here in this space is the key, so to say. If we as a collectivity can make that difference in our openness to the new consciousness, then it will impact the whole world and determine the world's future. Yes, the result is determined, but the timing will be determined by what we do, the state in which we are.
But Shalom Moses said also in agenda after 2000, Sri Aurobindo, all the world knows, Aurobindo, 50 years.
Yes, yes, yes. So we can close with a brief chant as we started with Om and a quiet concentration, reminding ourselves of our purpose here and the divine help which is there from above and nature's support and aspiration which is all around, which makes it the most important moment in the whole of human history and in our lives. Om